Hello, my name is James Trost, and this is A2 Insight. Today's guest is Council Member Elizabeth Nelson of the 4th Ward here in Ann Arbor. And this is not the first time that she has been on our program. She ran for office in her first attempt back 4 years ago when she was successful for her seat, and now she will be defending her seat. So, like last time, Council Member Nelson, welcome to A2 Insight.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we're very glad to have you here. And just so we want to know for the voters and for the people in the Ann Arbor to learn a little bit more about you, could you briefly just give us some information about your background, where you grew up, and get us up to your current academic endeavors or other things outside of what you're doing with City Council?
Sure. So I grew up outside of Chicago in the suburbs, and I went to college at Rutgers University and law school at University of Maryland. It was a very exciting year for me when both of those schools entered the Big Ten. I met my husband when in my last year of law school, and I actually moved here to be with him. And I was studying from the Michigan bar, planning our wedding, and passed the Michigan bar when we found out that my husband's job was transferring us to England. So we lived in England for 4 years and had quite a lot of newlywed adventures, including having my older son, Henry. And we moved back to Ann Arbor in 2004. I had my younger son, Hugo, in 2005. I was home with them for a number of years, just volunteering in the community in various organizations at their school. I ended up going back to school 6-7 years ago to get my certification to teach and a master's in education studies from the University of Michigan. And in 2018, I had been covering long-term subbing assignments that require certification. I was between jobs, and I focused on just council for about a year, and then I found a position at a local preschool. Trinity Lutheran Church hosts a preschool in their basement. And so I am now starting I just finished my 3rd year teaching there. We taught through the pandemic, and it's a part-time program. So right now, well, I'm off for the summer, but the last 3 years I have been juggling sort of part-time preschool teaching during the year and city council work.
No, that's interesting. Are you continuing with any kind of certification addition to that, or do you plan to continue working in the preschool area or any other area of student ages in the future in terms of teaching?
Well, I'm still certified to teach K through 8.
Okay.
But I'm quite enjoying the preschool population.
Okay.
It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. And the fact that we were able to remain open during the pandemic gave me a lot of perspective into both like how important it was for these kids, even in a masked environment, how important it was for them to be together, and also the challenges that the public schools were surely facing in terms of the requirements and recommendations and protocols for keeping everyone safe. We ran a program of like 25 kids, and we had to turn everything inside out because the recommendations in the fall of 2020 were, I mean, there was just a lot of anxiety and like how anybody was going to potentially catch COVID. And our population is still not quite yet old enough to be vaccinated. So I'm looking forward to that happening in the next, well, soon. This summer, I'm getting notifications that our population is now eligible for vaccination. So I'm hopeful that next year might be a little different.
Well, we all do. COVID has certainly caused a lot of challenges for so many of us in this crazy situation that we all encountered a few years ago. Well, you have had the honor of being elected by the citizens of Ann Arbor for the past 4 years to be representing the 4th Ward of Ann Arbor. And I guess the interesting thing is, since you've now are more of a seasoned veteran at this point, it seems to me my first question to you is, what has surprised you the most from running for office initially 4 years ago and the reality of what is happening to be an actual member of city council? And is it what surprised you the most, or just something about it that you didn't anticipate when you first got involved?
Well, I tell people that a lot of my service on council was influenced by my experience campaigning and talking to residents and hearing from residents. I was very naive and optimistic at the beginning of my term that some of our debates around issues of controversy, we could lower the temperature and reduce some of the turmoil if we really helped people access facts and information. And I've worked hard to try to do that. I continue to be surprised at the number of I guess the small number of people, but the very loud people in our community who are extremely hostile and are really ramping up the hostility in terms of how we debate issues. So that had, I like, as an example, when I first got on council, I thought, if I really work hard to help draw our debates to facts and help residents engage with facts, this will be appreciated. And so I participated on Twitter for probably about the first year I was on council, sharing information as I came across it. And then I quickly realized that there wasn't necessarily an interest in that kind of conversation, at least in certain communities, certain online communities, certain communities of advocates. That surprised me. I think also it has surprised me sometimes when the goals that we profess to be aiming towards when our policy doesn't match it. And I'm someone who really wants to ask questions and really wants to say, now wait a second, didn't we just say 3 months ago that this was our goal and now this is not matching our goal? I am somebody who really wants to talk through issues and work through them and debate them and hear all the perspectives and see if how we can bring them together and find common ground. And I think I have been surprised at a small number of people in our community who are very loud, who are very resistant to that.
Right. Mm-hmm. Well, and that is sometimes the squeakier wheel gets the notice, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily effective. To have people who are very vociferous in their views, that they may not necessarily be looking for solutions, but they like to be heard. That's certainly true in most of our areas. And I'm going a little bit off initially, but part of it is also because of the process itself. It's not easy to implement things because of the length of time it takes for anything to be moved forward. I'm going to use an example. I remember when I was interviewing people, 4 years ago, the big issue at the time was, what are we going to do about the train station? And this was a project that went on 10 years, and it wasn't mentioned in your website when I looked at materials, because again, this is one of these issues that we talked about, and then it went on. We did studies for years and years and years. It cost a lot of money. I'm just wondering, whatever happened to that? Is there any update, at least in terms of any movement as it relates to a new train station, upgrading the current station? And could you give me something on that, if there is anything at this point?
Well, it's funny you mentioned this because your understanding of that, your impression of that is the same as mine. No one had talked to me about the train station in the last 6 months. I knocked on a door just this afternoon where somebody started asking about the train station. I was like, you're the first person of like many, many people I've talked to mentioned that this go round. The last that I heard, the federal government communicated with the city and said that the proposal was too expensive and too big, and we were unlikely to get federal funds for it. I don't remember the details right off the top of my head, but that's the last communication that I understand the city has received. So there was hope to move forward with a new train station in the new location with the help of federal funds. And my understanding is that it's been communicated to the city that federal funding is not available.
Which means it probably is on hold once again for any resolution to that. All right. Well, one of the things that once you've been elected, you actually have to deal specifically when going around. I mean, one of the things I was impressed with in your first campaign was you were more than willing, and you wanted to go around. You were everywhere. You went to this ward from the right, you rode your bike all over. And so people have raised their concerns about dealing with city government or some of their problems. And I think, you're in a position to be empathetic when you're running, but when you're an actual on council, could you give me some examples of citizen concerns that you've been able to address and deal with, specifically now that you're in a position to do something about some of the issues? And what are some of the problems some of our residents have faced that you've been able to resolve?
Absolutely. And actually, this could have been part of my answer to like what's surprised me the most. Like, I think that it's apparent to me that some people might run for council and not understand just how much of this job is constituent concerns. Uh, just chasing down answers for residents, just helping them find the right person within the city to contact when you have a problem. As a for instance, there are some friends in Ward I have in Ward 4 who were following very closely the short-term rental regulation. And when we passed a loophole allowing the existing ones businesses to continue, that muddied the waters quite a bit. So the idea of identifying one that does or does not belong in a residential area is trickier. So people in the community are saying like, I'm seeing what looks like a new Airbnb in a residential neighborhood. How do I even complain about it? So I chased down, how do you complain about it? Another resident had a concern around an RV that was parked. For people who don't know, maybe Ward 4 includes the stadium up to Pauline, and this is relevant because there's a vacant lot across from Pioneer High School that often has people parked during football weekends, and there had been an RV parked that was sort of camping, like, the night before, the night after, and a resident was saying, well, I'm listening to this generator in my backyard basically for 2 nights straight, and is that right? And that was a matter of like going through the bureaucracy and figuring out like what is the regulation there, like what is the standard. And the city did end up reaching out to the property owner, and because it was in violation, and the resident was really grateful for that. Another resident was having a problem with a neighbor, and they needed sort of reassurance from the law enforcement that the neighbors statements around like, I'm going to get the police after you. Was this true? Were the police going to come after? Some of it is that I can contact the chief of police and get reassurance for a resident when they need it. There've been a couple of situations like that. A woman had catalytic converter stolen off of her driveway, and there was some anxiety about like, what was the path forward. I do want to say that our police department does tend to be very responsive and sensitive to residents. This is few and far between, but it is a situation where if somebody feels like they need some reassurance from higher up, I can help connect them with the person.
Good.
The more remarkable thing that somebody brought to me was her experience in parks programs. Ward 4 resident, African-American woman, came to me and described in great detail her experience of what she felt was conscious or unconscious racial bias in the way our parks programs were implemented. And I'm in a position where I could arrange a meeting with the city administrator and our HR director and connect her with people higher up in our organization. And once I've alerted people higher up that this is a problem that I want help in solving, it's usually easier for me to help connect residents to the people who can be helpful. Sometimes it's just like helping to reassure them that there is a solution available. Sometimes residents don't know what kind of services are available at City Hall. Oh, you know what? I was campaigning yesterday and I talked to a gentleman who said that he had sent in his application, his and his wife's application for absentee ballots. And he felt like it had been too long and he wasn't sure that it was sorted out. And as I was standing there, I said, well, you call the clerk's office. And I said, no, I'm just standing here right now. I'll call the clerk's office for you. So we called the clerk's office and we problem solved around that. It turns out that a couple of the solutions were not appealing to him because he doesn't use email, wasn't interested in going to City Hall to visit the second floor. He was like in his 90s. I'm really excited when there's an opportunity like that to solve a problem. And truly, when residents reach out to me, if I can go over there, if I can just bike over there and talk to them about it and see it in person, I'm there. Residents know that about me.
Great. Well, there are other issues of a little bit larger nature than the individual ones. And this is another issue I wanted to raise at this point, which again was also something we discussed 4 years ago. I've dealt with talking to the mayor and other people on council. And this is this perennial issue of affordable housing. Now, it's a major issue. We talked, as I said, it's been on for a long time. There are various ideas about how we could make Ann Arbor more affordable for people. There are people are getting priced out of the market. They're moving out. When you talk about affordable housing, and I looked at this at your website, what specifically can the Ann Arbor City Council or city government do to not either to make it more affordable to live here or to make it more accessible. You mentioned initially something about public lands itself. So could you give me some specifics about what you think we could do to make Ann Arbor more affordable for those who have less incomes?
Well, I think right now there is a philosophical difference on council. I think that we, one of the ideas is to rely on capitalism and the free market and supply and demand to tackle this. And I do not believe that that is enough. I I talk on my website about this identifying city-owned properties because that really was a remarkable situation where there was what started out as a proposal to look at two properties. Once we found out that there were other options to look at, we opened that up to 10 properties. And what's interesting about going from looking at two properties to 10 properties is it turns out the two properties that were initially that were the initial proposal, let's look at just these two, those ended up not being as appropriate for development. And so it's especially important that we all be real open-minded about, what are all the options available to us? What are all the choices that we have? Because when it's literally all or nothing, like it's this option, yes or no, it gets harder. So I sponsored the affordable housing millage to help fund what is ultimately going to be development on city-owned properties. I think we need to be more careful in what we're looking at in our zoning. What are the opportunities that exist for us to negotiate with developers to get a diversity of price points in housing? When we look at housing supply, I tried to tackle short-term rentals in a pretty serious way. We ended up creating a loophole that lost us a couple of hundred units of housing. But we have market forces that are at play, and I am not necessarily in favor of leaning into those market forces. I think we need to figure out what strategies are available to us to kind of prevent the gentrification of this town that is making it more and more expensive.
Mhm. Well, it is a complex issue because you are dealing with everything from builder incentives for new properties, as well as return on investments, and where would we place these things? But somewhat close to that is an issue I didn't know this until I did some research. The whole idea of Airbnb itself, or as you're calling them, short-term rentals. This has been a growing market everywhere where people found as alternatives to living in motels and hotels, but there also have been problems with it. So I'm interested in your thoughts of the growth of Airbnb. Is this a benefit? Is it a negative? What do you think is the solution to, or what we should do about people who want to rent out their houses for Saturday football weekends or whenever, but they're with the problems that come with it, if there are any?
I talk about this issue a lot as an example of where my primary agenda as a council member is to reflect the needs and the wishes of the community. I don't particularly have an agenda other than solving problems for residents. And so this was an issue that was brought to me by a resident. She had identified it on her block. I wasn't aware of it. Investors were increasingly buying up properties and turning them into full-time Airbnb short-term rentals, as in there was no primary resident in the house. They were empty most of the time or some of the time, and just different people in and out. The person brought it to me as more of a personal nuisance issue to her. She didn't like that she had lost neighbors and there was all of this transition around her. When I looked into the issue, I found out that this was a problem in all communities like Ann Arbor, where it is a successful business model, where there's enough tourism to sustain it. Communities like ours choose to regulate. You have to, otherwise it hollows out housing supply nearest the attractions. In our case, we have homes near downtown that we want people to be able to walk to school and walk to work. And if those houses are turned into hotels, effectively unsupervised hotels, that's a problem. I brought this issue to council. We did significant community engagement around it. And what we landed on was regulation that required licensing, so that if there was a nuisance property, we had a tool to deal with it. Previously, it was wholly unregulated, and We heard in our community engagement, we heard horror stories from probably isolated incidents, probably very small number of bad apples, but these properties that were just not well supervised and were a real problem in neighborhoods. We landed on regulation that would license so that we have a tool to deal with them. People who want to Airbnb their own homes, their primary residence, will have to get a license. And I presume the assumption is that if you're doing your own home, you are more motivated to set rules in place that will be protective of your own home and protective of the neighborhood. And you have to come home and face neighbors if something terrible happened, and that would be embarrassing, right? So Airbnb of short-term rentals must be licensed if it's your primary residence. And in resident, or the original version of this ordinance would have banned them banned
Right.
full-time.
Yes.
And the full-time investment properties, full-time businesses in residential areas. I was very disappointed when that regulation was eventually amended with a new council. We crafted a loophole and effectively gave 20 property investors a monopoly and said, all right, you get to stay in the residential neighborhoods, and now no more are allowed. I think the two reasons to regulate this was one was housing supply and two was nuisance. One is the housing supply issue is a much bigger problem worth tackling. And it also affects affordability because the value of a property near downtown skyrocketed with the profits that were available with these short-term rental businesses.
Right.
Yeah, and I will say that now that I am campaigning, I am realizing that it's especially too bad that we crafted these loopholes, because I've knocked on a handful of doors and been greeted with Airbnb guests, and then I inquire at the city, is that property licensed? No, it is not. So I'm actually asking the city administrator if we can have any kind of public facing database of all of the street addresses that are licensed as short-term rentals, because I don't know that I'm knocking doors in like 6 months from now to double check and see that Airbnb isn't happening in unlicensed properties. I'm not sure that residents are, but like if I see something across the street from me that looks like a short-term rental, rather than immediately filing a complaint, I think it would be good to actually look on a city website and see, oh yes, that address is licensed. It is allowed to be there. I think that would be a good tool for our community to track this and make sure it doesn't blow out of control.
Sure. Okay. And just for those residents, the licensure itself, in terms of the processing for that, is that a particularly difficult process for people? I mean, in terms of what they would go through, if I have a home in Ann Arbor and I'm following by the rules, is it filling out a form? Is it very burdensome for those who are legitimately wanting to rent out their home for a short-term situation? Or how does that process work?
I don't think it's overly burdensome. I think it might be $500. It might be sort of a sizable fee, but I'm not familiar with the details of it. But I don't know that any of our city processes are so onerous that anybody should have an excuse not to adhere to them.
Okay, well, that was but good. I understand that. All right, well, we'll move on, because it's in flux. One other thing I found kind of interesting, and I wish you could elaborate to this, and this is something new. I think it's come in the past, but you're kind of an advocate for something called a public municipal power utility as a better option to DTE. And again, this is a rather large subject about how we receive our energy and the dominance that DTE has. And I'm just interested in just the whole concept of a city, I guess it would be a city-owned public utility, or could you just expand a little bit more on what you mean by a public municipal power utility and how that would help Ann Arbor? Sure.
This is another issue that was brought to me by residents and advocates. Last year, I guess it was, I heard from members of our Energy Commission that this had been a specific question around a feasibility study had been languishing in that commission and had been discussed for months. And there was frustration there that it felt like it just kept getting postponed. And it was literally just this relatively small amount of money to move forward with getting the facts to find out what it would look like to get a publicly owned utility. And I brought a resolution to council asking the Energy Commission, since I had now been alerted to the fact that they had been discussing this for months, asking the Energy Commission to please give us a decision on whether or not they recommended that we invest in a feasibility study, like $100,000 or $150,000, something like that. I was surprised at how controversial this was. Apparently there is a lot of enthusiasm for partnering with DTE indefinitely, I guess. I am not super informed about the details of a public power utility. What is compelling to me is that our state rep, Yousef Rabi, and our state senator, Jeff Irwin, have both advocated for this as a good idea to pursue. And advocates who are a lot smarter than me and have been following this issue a lot more closely than me, I try to learn from them. I would guess that it's about 50-50 people who mention this to me, members of the public. About 50% of them are like, are you crazy? Like, how could our city handle that? Our city can't even fix the roads. And the other half are like, yeah, let's look into it. So we're still really early on in the process in terms of even having enough information to understand the benefits of this. I do understand that it is a long process to make it happen. The long-term benefits are something that we need to look at because it's front-loaded as something that is a fairly large and overwhelming task. But the facts as I understand them are that DTE wastes a whole lot of money on lobbying in Lansing to make sure that they have permissive regulations. We can look to other communities, examples of other communities that have pursued this and have found it to be a very excellent method of getting sustainable energy, having control over their energy supply. Now, I participated in meetings with DTE prior to passing the 820 plan, and I saw all of their facts and figures and charts and graphs, and they do not have a very ambitious, quick plan to get us off of coal burning sources of electricity. Partnering with DTE is not going to get us where we want to be as fast as we want to get there. And so that's one of the reasons that I am a proponent of this. It certainly jumping down the rabbit hole to find out what the details are and what it would look like.
Well, again, it's innovative, it's interesting, and I'm glad you're looking into it. Well, we got a couple more questions here, and I just wanted to ask, what would you say would you consider to be your major accomplishments during your first term here? What do you feel that you can say, I'm so glad I made a difference, and what were you felt your major accomplishments in the last term?
Well, I invited residents to offer me endorsements and make statements about what they appreciated about my service. And I heard from a lot of people that I had never ever met, that I didn't ever know. And it was overwhelming to me. I was very flattered by the things that they said. And I think that listening to residents, I think what they have appreciated as an accomplishment of mine is pushing our conversations and our debates around issues of controversy into a fact-based space that is not emotional rhetoric, and really working to keep residents informed. I have published a newsletter for every meeting that I have participated in. That's been nearly 100. I've sent out a summary of every item on our agenda 2 or 3 days before our meeting so that residents have an opportunity to give us feedback. I've done something that no one else ever did, which is publish voting charts so that you don't have to dig through 12 pages of minutes or watch a 7-hour meeting to see how things turned out. No one ever thought of that. I was motivated because in 2018, I was trying to understand the record of the incumbent that I was challenging, and I was digging through meeting minutes and I couldn't make heads or tails of it. And I decided that, if people are talking in generalities and sort of not talking about issues and specific votes, I want us to talk that way. I want us to talk not in generalities. I want us to understand these issues based on the facts of them. And I think that I consider it a really big accomplishment, the ways that I have confronted financial interests in this town. I've told people, like, I think I've made every financial interest in this town mad at me at one time or another. I've been in multiple meetings where landlords are screaming at me across the table because of my advocacy for renters' rights. Mostly, I think my accomplishment has been being a good listener and learning from other people's experiences. I've never rented in the city of Ann Arbor before, and I was the person on council who listened most closely when GEO and CSG came to us and talked to us about how challenging it was to lease apartments in town and how much of a need there was for us to intervene and regulate. It's a philosophy more than an accomplishment. I really appreciate the opportunity to serve this community, and I'm really grateful that community members see what I'm trying to do and appreciate it as well.
Mhm. Well, and that does lead to the fact that you are running again, and you are not in an uncontested race. So I would argue there are other candidates running for this position. And I guess my final question for you, Councilmember Nelson, is why should someone vote for you as opposed to any of your challengers for this term?
I've put in the work. It's funny, I look at when I started this campaign this year, I looked back to the 2018 campaign, some of the lit that I had put together. Some of it is just, it's so funny. In retrospect, when I put myself in the mindset that I was in 2019, when I knew, or 2018, when I knew so little, and now when I know that much more, I can look at my lit from 2018 and see that I actually followed through on the promises that I made. My lit in 2018 was pretty vague based on how little I knew. It was, promises to listen and messaging around, like, I hear that the community is frustrated and feel angry when like decisions come down and they don't find out until afterwards, and they don't feel like they were heard. I've worked really hard these last 3.5 years to create more opportunities for residents to be heard. And I have tried really hard to hear perspectives different from my own. When I look at the campaign lit from the 2020 elections, I see lots of campaign promises that were not fulfilled. I am somebody who pledged a point of view, service to the community, listening to community members, and elevating the voices of residents. And I have done that. Anybody running against me is making a promise that you can believe that they're going to fulfill them, or hope that they're going to fulfill them. But I have put in the work. I have put in work that is different than what others have done. You look at my campaign website, and I probably the most recent post is from 2 days ago. In 2018, when my husband and I were trying to figure out how to even do a campaign, we started looking at campaign websites, and we were finding campaign websites that had been dead for 2 years, that hadn't been updated. I can look at campaign websites from 2020, and they've been dead for 2 years. People who promised to do coffee hours and didn't. People who promised to do like creative ways of communicating and do nothing. I've been out there, and I have demonstrated my commitment to this job, and I'm a safe bet. I'll say that.
Ann Arbor City Council member Elizabeth Nelson is running for another term. Make sure you're all aware that the primary date coming up is August 7th, and please vote. Again, thank you very much, Council Member Nelson, and we wish you the best of luck in the upcoming election.
Thank you.
And for A2
Also, the
Insight.
election is August 2nd. The election is August 2nd, not 7th.
Right. I'm sorry, August 2nd.
I think you said 7th.
Oh, I did? Okay, it may come through, but yes, make sure you get there. Don't be there on the 7th. Make sure they're on the 2nd. So again, for A2 Insight, until next time, I'm James Trost. Thank you.